Welcome back, everybody, to the Latino Vote Podcast. I'm going to be flying with a different co-pilot this week as Chuck Rocha is off doing something, changing the world in his own mysterious, unique way. Mike Madrid here with a really special and important guest and a dear friend and a great brain who I think you're really going to enjoy. And I have no doubt that every one of you that hears this talk and this interview is going to be following up on what Gil Duran is going to be doing and talking and exposing in the course of the next few weeks and or months. He's onto some really extraordinarily big stories. But before we get to that, if that isn't enough, Gil also is a very well-known person here in California politics. Is an alum of an advisor, senior advisor to Governor Jerry Brown, worked for Kamala Harris, which we're going to talk about just a bit, has been a top journalist for as long as I have known him. He's threadlessly, seamlessly crossed all sorts of lines in the political space in California in a very unique way, going from being a journalist and an opinion writer and an editor to, again, a senior advisor to politicians and to somebody who is just extraordinarily driven by principle and is fierce, which I like all of those things. So when the opportunity came up to have a conversation with Gil, especially in light of the changes that are happening at the presidential level with Kamala Harris, Gil offers some very, very unique insight into Kamala. And so we're going to talk a little bit about her today, but I also want to explore some of what he's been doing in the face of some extraordinarily bad shit that's going on. Is that a fair way to say it, Gil?
Yeah, bad, weird, strange, scary.
Dangerous.
Yeah.
But his writing is getting a lot of national attention at the moment. And so we're going to talk about both of those. So how the hell is that for a wind-up, Gil?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Give us a short intro, like on kind of what your trajectory has been, because you have, I mean, it's fair to say, right? You've been in newsrooms, you've covered these politicians, you've worked for and advised a lot of these politicians. These are not small names. These are some of the biggest names in California now, apparently, American politics. So kind of share with the listeners kind of your trajectory and a little bit of what that background's looked like.
Sure. Well, I originally came from the Central Valley in California, a little town called Tulare. My grandparents were migrant workers. My parents were working class. They divorced when I was 6, and I stayed in Tulare till I was 14, and I moved to Kentucky. So I got this experience finishing high school in Lexington, Kentucky. Still have family there in Appalachia. Went to college in Indiana. So while most people associate me with California, I had 7.5 years out in the Midwest and sort of the South. Kentucky, sort of in that middle area. And I'll be there next week for a week to see family out in Appalachia. But after that, I became a reporter at the San Jose Mercury News. I was on my college paper, started doing high school journalism early on, and left there for after about 2.5 years because I wanted to go see the world. Ended up living in Guatemala for a while, traveling from Chiapas all the way to the Texas border and back on buses and pickup trucks. And when I got back to the States, journalism was sort of crashing and burning because of the whole .com bust and Craigslist taking the ad revenue. And I ended up working blue collar jobs myself for a couple of years. I was working in warehouses. I was a janitor at a nonprofit in West Oakland. I was a wildland firefighter in Oregon and Idaho for a few months one summer. And then I met Jerry Brown at a dinner party at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. And we had an interesting conversation for about 30 seconds. And a few months later, I ended up working for him. I had a friend who knew him. And so my entry into politics was completely accidental. I went from making $10 an hour, doing whatever job I could get, to making $55,000 a year and wearing nice wool Italian suits, which at that time seemed like $1 million to me compared to where I had been. So, and that became what I thought would be a temporary 2-year ride became a 15-year journey through California politics. And I ended up working for Mayor Viragosa in Los Angeles, then got recruited to go work for Senator Feinstein in Washington as her communications director, wrote the speech she gave at the opening of the Obama inauguration, and then Jerry Brown became governor, begged me to come back to California and Sacramento. I did that for 2 years. Went to work for Kamala Harris after that for a few months. Kind of felt like she was the future of politics. At the time, that meant being the governor. But that's obviously gone much further. Also consulted for Tom Steyer, did a bunch of environmental stuff. And then in 2018, I got a strange call while I was resting in Paris with my busy consulting lifestyle. And it was the Sacramento Bee asking me if I might be interested in coming back to journalism. In fact, it said, "This is a crazy idea, but your name keeps coming up." And so I became the editorial page editor of the Sacramento Bee, took a massive pay cut to do so. And then I actually had to work for my money hard 7 days a week. And now I'm freelancing, doing a lot of writing for the New Republic, do occasional pieces for the San Francisco Chronicle. I write a newsletter with Dr. George Lakoff called Frame Lab, where we talk about political framing and language. And so that's kind of so far has been the trajectory. So I wasn't one of those people who try to get internships and be in politics. I literally had resumes in at restaurants that weren't calling me back when the mayor of Oakland, Jerry Brown, hired me. So it just kind of happened.
A remarkable story. And one of the things I really love, not just about your story, but about who you are and your professionalism and kind of the stuff that you're working on, is you're one of those people who immediately you're like, damn, this guy's just an amazing journalist, and the stuff that he's writing is extraordinary. And then you realize, oh yeah, he's a Latino guy too. He's one of us. He's gente. He's one of our people. And that is so. I think it's so telling about the quality of your work, right? You don't need or aren't led by that, and it's okay if you are. It's certainly nothing that you shy away from. You're proud of it. You lean into it. But the stuff that you're doing is just so cutting edge. I hope you understand what I'm saying when I reference that. And we all deal with that balance. But you are, and I can't wait to get into the story that you're making these national news on. But first, I do want to talk about being a Latino in Kamala's world. And you did write, and we will attach both of the articles that we're talking about. But this article is a blog post, kind of, right, for Frame Lab, an article that you wrote about your unique trajectory with Kamala Harris, having worked with her for a very brief stint, what you learned, what you didn't, and what conclusion you're drawing. Can you kind of walk us through what you decided to put on paper?
Yeah, I can try. Still noodling on this because it's a complex situation. I worked for Kamala for 5 months in 2013 as her communications director and senior advisor, having played that role in different offices for much higher level politicians at the time, Jerry Brown, Dianne Feinstein. In fact, I went from being press secretary to the governor, where we had just won a big, huge election, Proposition 30, the kind of signature achievement of the Brown administration's first term. And I remember when I decided to take the job with Kamala, someone asked me, I think it was Kevin De Leon, was like, "Isn't this a step down?" And I said, no. I said, Kamala Harris is the future. And what I saw was the opportunity to kind of go and help someone who wasn't really well known be bigger, be better, kind of get out there. And I thought she would definitely run for governor in 2018. That was definitely the idea at the time. And against Gavin Newsom. But it didn't work out. And I don't want to really go into details. I haven't really gone into details, but a lot of these stories we've read over the past years about her inability to keep staff, questions about her communication style and office management sort of took a toll. And I was at a point in my career where I could do a lot of things. And, after a few months, I didn't really see a point in staying there. It wasn't enough for me to work with. And the office of the AG can be kind of quiet. I was talking to a reporter yesterday. Now everybody in the world wants to talk to Kamala Harris. I remember asking people if they wanted interviews with the AG and being turned down. Right. They probably regret that now, those reporters. Yeah. Once I set up a coffee with a columnist and they had coffee and he didn't even write anything, but I was just really scraping to find something to put on the schedule because it's really hard to get the kind of interest in the AG that you get in other offices. I didn't have a hard time placing Jerry or Feinstein. The moment you open that opportunity, people are there. So I left and I went on to my quiet consulting phase, working with different clients. But when I returned to journalism, as editorial page editor of the Bee. I took that job 1 month before Kamala Harris ends up launching her 2020 presidential campaign. And so now I remember my editor saying, so how are you going to handle this? Because now I'm in the position where I've accepted the duty and responsibility to write unflinchingly about politicians and to hold politicians to account. And so I decided to do exactly that. And I ended up becoming, probably because of my previous relationship having worked for her, one of her most vocal and insightful critics. And, pretty much kind of predicted that her campaign would not pan out and would not thrive. And that's what ended up happening. And my pieces were in the New York Times and going viral and being used by, TV stations, etc. And Politico ends up calling me the go-to anti-Harris quote. So, and that wasn't done out of a sense of totally out of my personal experience. It was more being able to see what was really going on in the campaign because I know what is potentially going on. At the same time, I will say, one of the lines that I wrote that went kind of viral and haunts me to this day was, you can't run the country if you can't run your campaign. This is when her campaign was sort of flailing, and there was all these stories with the campaign staff leaking the internal drama and dynamics of the campaign. And people still repeat that line in pieces today. But when she dropped out, my editor said, well, you've written a lot about why Kamala doesn't work out as this presidential candidate. What are some good things that might make her a good vice presidential candidate? So I wrote a piece about why it could make sense for Biden to pick Kamala as vice president. So I did the opposite as well, and just sort of highlighted what her strengths were and what it is she has as that special gift as a politician. All politicians, as you know, are different. They bring different things to the table. Some of them have a charisma. Some of them have the gift of gab. Some of them are really sharp on policy and people trust them because they feel that they're very substantive. Others are great at building coalitions and being in the middle of all these different opposing powers. And so I try to kind of dig down and summon that. And then she ended up as the vice president. And written a couple of columns about her since then, because the troubles have continued a bit. But now we're in a very different situation.
And that leads us to what situation? But yeah, well, there's two ways I want to go with this. Sorry. And we're going to head down both of these. But you make the argument that this moment in time, I don't want to say you've changed your perspective. You have just been able to see the broader picture of what it all means. And you recognize the extraordinary existential threat that the country faces in this election, and you're supporting Kamala, essentially. Is that fair to say?
Definitely.
And that's because of the moment? Only because of the moment?
Well, I think, there's a choice between a democracy and a dictatorship, I guess, is the way that I see it. And she is the nominee now. And, I think we were, in the past few weeks, we had other opinions about what should happen with the race, whether Democrats were panicking and making decisions based on a fear that might not be as bad as it was. There's been a lot of groupthink and public panic over the past few weeks. But the sudden vibe shift to Kamala seems to have really united people for a moment and created a sense of energy and euphoria that Democrats are going to need to get people to the polls and to put out a positive vision about what's possible with Democrats. And I think in a situation like this, I've been meditating on what is a politician really. And Harris was the vice president to Biden, and she's kind of the clearest heir to his administration and legacy, and to carry on that vision. And while she may be imperfect, as we all are, that doesn't really matter right now, because as Biden said, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And anything negative you could say about Kamala Harris, you can say worse about Donald Trump. right? I've criticized Harris. I said this on the BBC. Yes, I've criticized Kamala Harris, but JD Vance, who is Trump's vice presidential nominee, compared him to Hitler, right? I've never compared any of my bosses to Hitler. JD Vance said that Trump committed sexual assault and that he was reprehensible and an idiot. So if we're going to have a contest of who said what about what candidate and what their flaws are, Trump is much, much worse. And I think that the values that Harris brings to the office, the people she brings to the office, because it's not just the president who does all the work all day, it's the people they bring, is clearly the only path that will put the country in a position to still be a democracy where elections matter, where truth matters, and where freedom is expanding rather than contracting. And to me, it's a no-brainer. It's an easy choice. That doesn't mean that I don't have my opinions or critiques, but they don't really matter right now in the grand scope of things. And as someone who's criticized Harris's flaws and stumbles, I am praying mightily that this is the moment when the greatness that is within her, that we've all seen within her at one time or another, will truly reach fruition. And that she'll deliver on all the hopes and dreams and aspirations that millions and millions of people have projected onto her. Because it's not just about her as a person. It's about all of us collectively and what we can make happen. And I think she has enough experience and has made enough mistakes, which is a important form of experience, to summon her greatness and do better. And that's what I'm hoping for. In all of my pieces, I've always left open that little crack of hope. I knew she was important. I know what people see in her. And so this is the moment that's going to test her mettle, and it would be immoral to root against her.
Well, that was so well put, all of that. And I think you've really captured a lot of people's feelings, even if they're not enamored with her. And there's clearly that euphoria. It is fascinating to see just how different the Democratic voter feels in this country compared to a couple of weeks ago. But you are hopeful, and I think it's also fair to say, anybody who is familiar with you, no one says that you're petty or that this is personal. It's real criticism meant to be constructive, to help a politician be more self-reflective. No one has ever suggested that the criticisms were unfair. And again, I think it is very telling too that, and I think you've captured the moment so well. Let me ask one more question on this before we jump into the other stuff. What can you tell the country? What would you tell the country to expect? Like, who is Kamala Harris who's the person that we don't know that we should be looking for? And what do you think she will be presenting over the course of the next couple of months?
I think she's someone who was born to make the case for what this country can really be. If you look at her background, you look at her upbringing, you look at the values her mother, who was an immigrant, instilled in her, there's no question about where Kamala's true values lie. In politics, as you go up through the levels, some of that gets muddled or moderated out because that's the only way you rise up to a high level. But once you're in the highest office in the land, you can kind of really become your true self and deliver. And I have no doubt that if she were president, the people she would bring and the policies she would support would be things that are the most beneficial to working people, to families, to Latinos, to African Americans, to poor blue collar whites. I mean, that's what Kamala was born to do. She comes out of Berkeley. Her parents were from the movement. She tells a story about one of her first words being freedom. Freedom. So, and that's what this election is about: freedom. So she's always somebody, I think, who appears to have a great destiny. And hopefully that destiny will be that she wins and proves her critics like me wrong. I would love to be proven wrong, and really delivers, because it's not just about her. It's about all of us together and what the future is. And I think that we're going to see that. We already see a bit of that. I think being the nominee, she seemed a bit more confident. Now she needs to bring that confidence to her interviews, right? No stumbles, no being afraid. Really say what you mean. Really own the moment. Be the bigger dog in the conversation. And to the debate, where she's got to make sure she's the prosecutor against the criminal and putting Trump in his place. And I think that maybe finally being in this position, that'll all coalesce. I think that the polls are going to normalize a bit. I think this is going to be a nail biter, not a runaway. And so that's why, while I'm enjoying seeing people feel this exuberance and this relief from the dread, we have to prepare for the long haul and for a race where there's going to be more second guessing and doubting and panic in some quarters. But we have made a choice here, and you got to push. And one thing in thinking about how to approach Kamala as a longtime critic has been, look at how the Republicans rally around their nominee, despite all of his flaws and warts and convictions and lies. And there's something to be said for the ability to do that in a predicament where everything is on the line. And watching some of your commentary online, I've thought maybe we should get some of the anti-Trump Republicans to run the ticket for us, because Democrats have trouble holding the line. And it was like the Tower of Babel for a minute there. And I didn't even know what to think or who to believe anymore. And everybody you talk to has some different cockamamie theory about what should happen now, including Aaron Sorkin, who thought Mitt Romney should be the nominee. But so I think we got to hang together. And if we are collectively united, I think it makes it easier. And there'll be some mistakes and some foibles, and we just gotta see past that shit and head toward the goal.
Yeah, again, this is why you're so good at what you do. I think you captured the whole thing so well. Let me pivot now and explore this incredible topic that you have I don't want to say uncovered. You've been following the DNA of the tech culture in San Francisco and Silicon Valley for many years. This is not new to you. I think people need to understand that first and foremost. But you also bring something extraordinary, which is a keen political insight and understanding to the emergence of a movement. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, or if it's kind of almost this cult-like. I'm struggling for the words, but I'm sure you'll capture what they are. But there's a strange brew coming to life in the Silicon Valley, which has led to a very dangerous, peculiar, pernicious world view with some of the most powerful men in the world. And I'm talking about Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and JD Vance now. And I want you to kind of, a lot of the listeners here are not familiar at all with what I'm talking about. So what I want you to do is sort of kind of give us the backdrop and walk people through this story, because it's kind of jaw-dropping in its scope and what it means. And I know the story is blowing up nationwide. So share with us what you're finding.
Sure. I think the simplest way to start is that people have probably noticed some of these Silicon Valley, San Francisco-based tech billionaires are starting to line up behind Donald Trump this year. And it's weird, because here's a convicted felon, an adjudicated rapist, a twice impeached president. And why now? Who converts to Trumpism now in 2024, post January 6th? Well, the thing to understand is that it's not just about lower taxes and friendly regulations. That's often how it gets described. But there's an ideology emerging out of Silicon Valley among these influential billionaires. And in this ideology, democracy is no longer the preferred style of government. Democracy is considered a failure, is considered outdated. And what they favor is a new system of dictatorships based on corporate control of political entities like cities, like states, like the White House. And they are working to make that happen and to bring along others in tech who may not be Republicans, but may really want to make millions of dollars in crypto or in venture capital or tech. And they are openly saying this. This is not a guess I'm making. They have thinkers who write it out, who talk about it. And so in covering politics in San Francisco over the past couple of years, like a lot of reporters, I was kind of covering the more superficial narrative, the recall against Chesa Boudin, the attempt to put a mayor in who is friendly to tech. But I noticed there was something else going on. There was a polarization taking place. There were a lot of tech people who would nominally seem to be Democrats spouting really right-wing talking points on things like crime, on things like homelessness, on things like harm reduction for opioid addiction. And the more I started digging in, the more I realized that there was this whole other level and layer of conversation taking place, and that everything being talked about on this lower level, or maybe I should say it's a higher level, was being realized in San Francisco politics today. An effort to really take control of the entire city government. A guy named Gary Tan at Y Combinator, who is spearheading this effort. A really aggressive style of attacking progressive Democratic politicians, just villainizing, making them the other and the enemy. And when I started digging into this, I found some very interesting material that was actually also shocking. And that's what's allowed me to write about the ideology in a way that people understand. For example, in January, Gary Tan, the Y Combinator CEO, got drunk and went on a Twitter rant in which he uttered what appeared to be a death threat against 7 progressive supervisors on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, which is the body that governs San Francisco. This finally got a lot of attention, and people finally wrote about him, even though he'd been kind of being aggressive in this way for months. And it kind of shed a light on the role he's trying to play. Well, I wrote a piece about that. And in writing about Gary Tan and his aggressive meltdown, I found that one of his major influences is this guy named Balaji Srinivasan, who's the former CEO or CTO of Coinbase, who had written an entire book about the need for tech people to exit democracy and create their own countries called network states. And when I looked into the network state thing, you realize that they're kind of trying to do that in San Francisco, trying to take over an entire government and make it a government by tech. Simultaneously in Solano County, there was a project called California Forever that was being proposed. All of these tech guys, one of them, Marc Andreessen, who's very much involved in all of this stuff, trying to create a new tech-governed city, tech-funded city in the middle of Solano County with lots of opposition from the locals. They just dropped that effort this week. They're going to take 2 more years to try to do it again. So I started listening to these long podcasts these guys do. One thing about these tech, I call them tech authoritarians. Some people call them tech fascists, which is also valid. And there's some elements of fascism definitely in it. So I find this long podcast, 6-hour-long podcast interview with Balaji Srinivasan, the former Coinbase CTO, talking about a plan for San Francisco where the tech aligned citizens all wear gray uniforms. And they partner up with the police by bribing the police to be on their side, giving them banquets, giving their relatives jobs, etc. And they buy up entire blocks of the city, and they push out all Democrats. Democrats are not allowed in the gray controlled areas of the city. And as they gain more and more control of San Francisco, this so-called gray tribe will also erect statues to remind people of how bad Democrats are and screen propaganda films on the same theme, persecuting Democrats. And at a certain point, when they've gained a mass, they will march through the streets in a gray pride parade with the police alongside them and Anduril drones flying overhead in formation. A really, really scary vision. And so I wrote about that, and that really kind of kicked the hornet's nest. And I've continued to write about that.
Were there denials, Gil? Like, I don't, this sounds so peculiar and strange and fringy. It sounds like one guy in his basement, but it's not. There's a pervasive thought along these lines, if not the specifics, but it is a very present part of the culture, the tech culture in San Francisco. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. Normally this would be like a weird thing. Some guy said on a podcast, who cares? But the story really was that when you look at Balaji Srinivasan and who he's connected to, well, Gary Tan is a major fan and friend of Balaji Srinivasan. In fact, last October, Srinivasan had a conference in Amsterdam called the Network State Conference to discuss this idea. And Gary Tan was at the conference talking about how what he's doing in San Francisco is part of this network state cult ideology, this idea to create new tech governed societies. Marc Andreessen and Peter Thiel have a company called Pronomos Capital, which is trying to invest in creating these cities all over the world, these tech governed cities. And one of the advisors to Pronomos Capital is Balaji Srinivasan. When he wrote his book, The Network State, which is available for free to read online, you can read the first page and get the idea. The CEO of Coinbase, Brian Armstrong, wrote a blurb just extolling the brilliance of Balaji Srinivasan. The more you look, the more you see that people who should know better than to associate with this kind of radical, extreme ideology are all about it. And I know this is a lot to take in for people, right? But the basic idea is this, I think, in a nutshell. Just as crypto was able to create a new forms of currency that are trying to undermine the dollar and replace the dollar, these folks also want to create new forms of government that can undermine and replace current forms of government. And these new governments will not be democracies. And instead of politicians and elected leaders, we will have dictators or kings who are basically tech CEOs. And because they have amassed so much money, they now want power. And they're trying to buy their way to power. And an important way they're trying to do that is with JD Vance.
That horrifying. But again, I think people need to understand. And again, you're writing for where are these articles appearing that you're writing?
Yeah, I've been writing a series for the New Republic. So far, there are 4 pieces. The first piece looked at California Forever, the Solano County project, and how all these billionaires have this idea to build network states. The second piece focused on Gary Tan and his efforts to spearhead a takeover of San Francisco city government and impose all of these sort of right-wing tech ideas on the city. The third piece looked at Balaji Srinivasan and his plan for a gray tribe takeover of San Francisco, and the persecution of and expulsion of Democrats. And the fourth piece, which just dropped this week, looks at JD Vance and his relationship to Peter Thiel and a guy named Curtis Yarvin, who is sort of the big thinker behind a lot of this stuff. He's a former computer programmer from San Francisco who explicitly states that democracy should be replaced by dictatorships. And in one of his pieces from 2008, suggested that the underclass, meaning homeless people or poor people, I'm assuming, should be converted into biodiesel or else locked up in prisons where they'd be connected to virtual reality for the rest of their lives, so that they could kind of not bother anybody, which sounds like a pretty pernicious form of torture. And so that story has really kind of gotten big over the past few days because Thiel and Yarvin are the major influences on JD Vance, who has actually cited some of this Yarvin guy's ideas and ideology in interviews. And if you look at JD Vance, he is pretty much a creation of Peter Thiel. And when you look at the billionaires trying to create this new world where billionaires control it, where billionaire authoritarians control it, you see Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, David Sachs, who's another member of the PayPal mafia. These guys all started PayPal together. Marc Andreessen, and they are the major 4 who have led the charge to back Trump. And in backing Trump, they appear to have gotten a big prize out of it, which is JD Vance on the ticket. So when I started writing about this stuff, I thought, what they're doing in San Francisco was sort of a prototype, and that maybe eventually they would try to take it nationally or statewide. Balaji Srinivasan talks about the need to create tech-aligned gray tribe politicians to start seizing power inside institutions and converting them over to the tech authoritarian control. I did not expect it to happen right now. I thought I'll write a book or something, and then in 3 or 4 years, people will know this is what happened in Northern California. This is what's going to happen nationally. But they appear to be accelerating at an extremely rapid pace. And this is what it's about. It's about replacing democracy with dictatorship and using their massive amounts of wealth to buy as much power as they can as quickly as they can.
Is it ideological, or is it just simply the power now? I mean, what is their problem with democracy? What's their fundamental issue with it?
Their fundamental
it's inefficient. It's just the tech culture. And again, these guys aren't playing the long game. They go for everything now, right? Mm-hmm. That's part of their way. But like, I don't get what it is about democracy. Is it just it's too bumbling and inefficient and slow for the vision that they want to see the world evolve or change into?
They can't win under democracy, seems to be the main critique. And why should this much power be in the hands of all the little people? They often kind of hearken to classical writers and readers from ancient Greece, but they don't seem to have learned the lessons of Greece and Rome. The idea that that dictatorship and oligarchy will somehow be the permanent government system seems to be vastly undermined by history. But they don't see democracy as sustainable for them. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to be responsive. They don't want to be a part of a social contract, in essence. They want to be above it, and they don't want to be subjected to the laws of any land. They want to be the law. And that seems to be it. I think it's sort of a bit of a megalomaniacal ideology based on having way too much money and being surrounded by people who never tell you how stupid you are and never tell you to shut up.
And it's just, I guess it's just a culture that's developed over decades of just amassing so much wealth and already living in a different universe, right? They just can't relate and don't want to relate to anybody.
One thing that really shocks me is the degree to which they seem so aggrieved. Look at Elon Musk. He's crying and complaining all the time. He's the victim here. The richest man in the world is the victim here. Balaji Srinivasan's worth hundreds of millions of dollars ostensibly, complaining all the time about how life isn't fair to him. Imagine how it feels to be poor. Imagine how it feels to be working class and struggling and not knowing if you can pay your bills or send your kids to college and if they'll be able to get a job after that. They seem to have no empathy for the struggles of real people and are soaking up for themselves all of the victimization and aggrievement and channeling that into this ideology where if they could only seize all the power, they could be free of it. And people often call this libertarian, and I think that's the wrong word. I think there were some libertarian roots early on. This is straight up authoritarian now. It's not about the freedom of the individual. It's about certain individuals having all the freedom and everyone else being basically a serf in a techno-feudal society.
How do these people find each other? I mean, is there something happening in the culture where, look, I can get where there's always one person who's a peculiar odd duck with these ideas in any society, in any culture, in any neighborhood. But there's a whole band of these guys, and they're extraordinarily wealthy and influential and have the capacity to I don't know, maybe make a lot of these things happen, or at least, in one of your stories, you talked about California Forever. They were literally buying a massive swath of land to build a quasi nation state. They called it a city, but it was something very different than that, to kind of live off the grid, like Ayn Rand kind of stuff. Like, we're going to just remove ourselves from society and live by our own rules. And it wasn't like a small, cul-de-sac. We're talking a massive swath of land. And now you're talking about them trying to directly take on San Francisco city government. And it doesn't surprise me that they're going right at what they would deem the heart of the beast, right? This ideological vision that is contrary to their worldview, and then now they've got a vice presidential candidate. Like, how is this all happening? It's not two or three people.
No, it's a movement. It's an ideological movement. I think it's still rather small, but like you said, it's formidable because it's backed up by some billionaires. And it's almost as if they read all the science fiction books and decided they wanted to be the villains. Because if you read science fiction, it's the villains who are doing these kinds of things, not the good guys. And um, a thing to be aware of, too, in addition to the money and the power, are these very strange cult-like ideas coming out of Silicon Valley today that also play a role in this. There is transhumanism, the idea that humans must merge themselves with computers and become more than human, go beyond being human, and in fact, even defy death and no longer die. There's a guy named Brian Johnson, I think his name is, who is claiming he's not going to die, that he's going to live forever. He's on Facebook selling an olive oil called snake oil, which is supposed to be filled with all kinds of vitamins that'll keep you alive forever. There's long-termism, which is the idea that the billions and billions of people to be born in the future are more important than the people alive on Earth now. And that so anything that these tech guys do, because they see themselves as the saviors of the future, is justified and necessary because that's the only way we're going to become a multiplanetary species and live on far into the future. There's the singularity, the idea of, AI sort of becoming smarter than humans and taking over. And a lot of their money now is going toward AI now that crypto's more shaky. There's cosmism, the idea that Elon Musk, we got to go to Mars, we got to go to space. So they're kind of preaching this sort of millenarian in-time scenario where the only way our species can survive is if these tech guys and their weird ideas are allowed to do whatever they want to get us into the future. And anything that stands in their way is the enemy. And democracy stands in the way. Because looked at another way, these are a bunch of weird excuses for why billionaires should pay no taxes, have no rules, and just be above everyone else and above democracy even. And so there's a lot of reading to do if you're really interested, if people are really interested in this stuff. But there's this underlying tech cult ideology at the heart of this that could prove to be very dangerous. I think this is the most important political story of the year in terms of ideology, not in terms of the horse race and the nominees.
Yeah.
And I doubt if we're going to get through this without Elon Musk trying some very serious trick on Twitter to push the election over to Trump.
Yeah. I can't imagine that. I think that was the whole reason for buying the damn thing. Like I said, these tactics that we're seeing, they're not small game stuff. It's not a little PR effort. It's buying Twitter. It's leveraging Trump to get JD Vance on the ticket. These are extraordinarily big moves. Gil, we got to wrap it up. I could go on for hours with you, but I really appreciate you being with us today. Phenomenal guest, phenomenal insight obviously on Kamala Harris and some of the biggest ideological undercurrents driving the current election. I'd love to have you back on later in the cycle if you'd be willing to join us. But thank you again so much for having us. And until next week, and we will talk soon.